In 1857, a trial gripped the nation. A 22-year-old woman of well-breeding stood trial in Scotland for murder. The case captured the attention of not just the local media, but newspapers from as far away as London, Paris, and New York. It was called the trial of the century and scandalized Victorian society. This is her story. On March 29, 1835, a daughter was born in West Regent Street, Glasgow, to James Smith and his wife, Janet Hamilton. She was the first of 5 children, and after her grandmother was called Madeline. The Smiths were extremely well connected in Glasgow society. Upon marrying Janet in 1833, the daughter of David Hamilton, the most famous and respected architect in the west of Scotland, James Smith was thought to have married up. James was a partner in his father's firm and was himself an aspiring architect. But the road to success was rocky. He was forced to declare himself bankrupt in 1843 when his father's insurance business failed. But with the assistance of some friends, James had recovered and by the early 1850s had cemented himself as part of the Glasgow business elite. The trappings of success included a townhouse in Glasgow's fashionable Blythewood Square, a country retreat overlooking the River Clyde near Helensburgh, and 3 servants, a general maid, and other bodies to look over the properties. Madeline would join fashionable society and enjoy the socialite life that Glasgow had to offer. Madeline moved in the highest strata of Glasgow society. She regularly attended social gatherings with her parents and spent the summers at their country house. Wealth brought privilege, and at the age of 14, Madeline traveled to London to attend finishing school. As a pupil at Mrs. Alice Gordon's Academy for Young Ladies in Clapham, Madeline was taught godliness and good manners. The curriculum consisted of daily prayers, piano lessons, walking, discussions of current affairs, needlework, deportment, and elocution designed to rid any trace of her Glasgow accent. In short, everything consistent with making Madeline enviable marriage material for a suitable member of her class. Mrs. Gorton thought Madeline to be diligent, attentive, and exceedingly bright, but also given to stubborn sulks, which most alarm us. The curriculum included very little in terms of intellectual stimulation, and the school's strict moral code meant that there was little relief from the tedium of the daily routine. The company of young men was forbidden, with the exception of the clergy attached to the local St. James Chapel, although the occasional closely supervised outing was permitted. The girls resorted to smuggling various romantic texts into the academy, which provided the basis for daydreaming, although it seems only Madeline was destined to act out her daydreams. She returned to the family home in Glasgow at the age of 17 to a life of idleness, with a constant round of social obligations to fill the void. Madeline was simply marking time until a husband could be found and she could assume her natural role as a wife and a mother. However, these orthodox expectations failed to take into account her genuine sense of discontent with Glasgow and family life. After 3 years in London, the city seemed highly provincial. She often wrote of her dislike of Glasgow, the rain and the cold, and the boredom of family occasions, writing, "I never felt so tired of Christmas Day. We have a large dinner party, all dull people, and New Year's Day was a great bore, and a horrid day. The only social occasions she seemed to enjoy were balls, where she could be as flirtatious as her nature would allow." Her disenchantment with family life was compounded with the alienation Madeline felt towards her parents. James Smith was the undoubted stern, strict, patriarchal head of household, whose word was law, and, as someone who had married above himself, was determined that his daughters would do the same. Like most successful businessmen, he was absent from home more often than not, leaving for work at 8 in the morning, while Madeline rose at 9, and not returning until the evening. He played little role in bringing up his children, save on Sundays when he presided over family prayer sessions. Madeline remarked that he seemed estranged from her, and when on occasion she, appearing in low spirits, looked to him for comfort, he never notices. While James seemed strong, almost terrifyingly so, Madeline's mother was the very opposite. From the sparse evidence we have, Janet Smith was passive, submissive, and frequently ill. She relied on her eldest daughter to run the family home when she was at a low point, something which Madeline wrote in June 1856 she had done for the last 2 years. The mother's illnesses and the perception of her as weak made her an unlikely confidant for Madeline, and although her sister Bessie was a possible substitute, it would appear, perhaps as a result of their age gap, that they were never very close. Thus, by 1855, Madeline, barely aged 20, was bored, frustrated, and looking for some adventure, or a diversion. At 5 feet 2 inches tall, Madeline was a fine beauty, with fair skin, deep-set dark eyes, and long hair of polished ebony. Her beauty, mixed with a powerful personality, meant she could have her pick of the eligible men in Glasgow, and Madeline was as bored of her possible suitors as the dull Glasgow social life. Until one day, while strolling unchaperoned along Sauchiehall Street on the arm of her sister Bessie, Madeline made the acquaintance of a Frenchman named Pierre Emile L'Angelier, and Emil was certainly unlike anyone from her inner social circle. At 32, the mysterious stranger was worldly, having already lived in both Edinburgh and Paris before finally settling in Glasgow, and was fluent in French and English. He claimed to be a descendant of the French aristocracy, but in fact he was born in Jersey. His father was a nurseryman who fled France during the Revolution. Pierre was dandified in his clothing, often wearing ornate waistcoats and sporting a twirling mustache, yet he earned only 10 shillings a week as a packing clerk at Messrs. Huggins and Company on Bathwell Street, a less salubrious part of Glasgow. In spite of his humble position and limited means, because of his undoubted charm, L'Angelier was popular with women and was considered to be a bit of a ladies' man by those who knew him. He was also dazzled by wealth and position, and was ready to move up in the world. But in Victorian Glasgow, class separation was a strictly enforced concept. Although Emil was not from a wealthy background, he ingratiated himself through church connections with those on a higher social plane. Such connections led to an introduction to the daughter of one of the most prominent families in Glasgow. There was an instant attraction. Emil was charming and rather dashing, and soon after their introduction, he began sending single red roses to Madeline's house in Blythewood Square. Even though she knew a warehouse clerk was hardly an acceptable companion for a young lady of her status, Madeline was attracted to Emil for precisely that reason. He was so different from the men she had met at the social gatherings her parents took her to, where she met the creme de la creme of Glasgow society. The pressure must have always been there for her to make an appropriate match, and Emil provided the much-needed relief from the tedium and routine of her daily life. After they were introduced, the couple arranged to meet in bookstores and other public places, and occasionally took walks through the streets. This was a risky venture for Madeline, as at that time, young respectable single women were not allowed to go out unchaperoned with men. When Madeline left the city for her family's summer house, the two began exchanging letters. and on returning from the countryside, the couple began to meet in secret at night. Soon, Madeline's father learned of the friendship and demanded that she put a stop to it. Disappointed, but aware of the social customs of her time, Madeline reluctantly wrote to Emil that their friendship must end and wished him all happiness in the future. But Emil was not to be put off. He wrote back, entreating her to meet with him. He persuaded a female friend, Miss Mary Perry, to allow them to meet covertly at her house. Madeline relented, and the correspondence and meetings continued, although secretly. L'Angelier would drop his letters through the bars of the basement windows of Madeline's bedroom, in the pretense of tying a shoelace. They met at Miss Perry's when they could, and occasionally met late at night at Madeline's house, long after her family was asleep. He would wait in the winter darkness and talked with Madeline once her sister Janet was asleep. Now and again, Madeline made cocoa and passed a cup through the window to him. For 2 years they exchanged many letters, meeting secretly in the country whenever her family journeyed there for their holiday. As time went on and their romance intensified, Madeline promised to marry him, and in June of 1856, they became lovers, an unthinkable taboo in Victorian times. Although no ceremony had been performed, they addressed each other as husband and wife in their letters. Meanwhile, Madeline's parents, not knowing that the relationship with Emil had continued after it had been forbidden, began to search for a suitable husband for Madeline. They settled on 30-ish William Harper Minnick, a junior partner of the Holdsworths. In May of 1856, Madeline wrote to Emil to warn him of the new resident in the flat above the family at Blythewood. Minnick moved in the same society as Madeline and had an income of £3,000 a year, and most importantly, Madeline's father approved of him highly. In September of 1856, Minnick stayed with the Smith family at their summer house, and he spent much time with Madeline. But Madeline still preferred her penniless clerk. While Minnick was paying polite addresses by day, Pierre was meeting Madeline in the garden at night. But soon Madeline's letters to Emil started to cool off and become less frequent. From the autumn of 1856, Madeline and Emil's relationship began to fray, as William Minnick began to spend more time with the Smith family. Rumors were beginning to spread that Madeline was to be married to William. In September she wrote, "Mr. Minnick has been here since Friday. He is most agreeable." Emil was overcome with jealousy, and Madeline had begun to make excuses as to why they could not be married. Madeline finally relinquished hope her father would ever condone her marrying Emil. Emil did not have the means to set up a family home for them, nor provide for her in the manner with which she was accustomed. Knowing that Minnick would be a more suitable husband for a young woman of her class, Madeline encouraged Minnick's affections and accepted his marriage proposal in late January of 1857. Breaking off her relationship with Emil, Madeline asked for her letters to be returned, writing, "I trust your honor as a gentleman that you will not reveal anything that may have passed between us." While Emil firmly instructed Madeline to burn all his letters, likely to prevent anyone in the Smith household from accidentally coming across them, Emil kept almost all of Madeline's letters. Pierre replied in a thinly veiled blackmail attempt, threatening to give her father her letters, unless she followed through with marrying him. Madeline wrote back desperately, "Emil, for the love you once had for me, do nothing till I see you. For God's sake, do not bring me to an open shame." She wrote on and on in this vein, imploring Emil not to reveal the extent of their relationship. She wrote, "I grow mad. I have been ill, very ill. I feel as if death indeed would be sweet." The very next day, Madeline sent the page boy to the doctor to procure for her some arsenic, with a note explaining that she required it for cosmetic purposes. Around 2 months later, on the morning of March 31st, William Minnock stopped by the Smith home to pay a call on his intended bride and found the family and servants in a panic. Madeline was missing. He suggested that she might have gone to the Smiths' summer house on the Clyde. The family agreed this was possible, and Minnock proposed that he and Madeline's brother Jack travel to the summer house while the rest of the family remained at home, in case she returned. Minnock and Jack took the next train from Glasgow to Greenock, and there caught a steamer headed for Helensburgh. Moving through the crowds of people on the boat, they found Madeline sitting calmly, looking out at the water. She had boarded the boat earlier in Glasgow, and showed no particular surprise at seeing the two of them. Sitting down next to her, Minnock gently asked why she had fled and caused such worry to her family and friends. She began to respond, but Mr. Minnock told her to wait, as there were too many people about who might overhear. Once in the privacy of the large summer house, Minnock asked again for the reason behind her flight. Madeline cryptically told him that she was afraid her parents would be very upset at what she had done, and promised to tell him more at a later time. On a long carriage ride, broken by only infrequent conversation, the three rode back to the candlelight windows and gas lamps of a Glasgow evening. That very morning, on the other side of the tracks, Emil was found dead in his apartment. The cause of death? He'd been poisoned. In his pocket, a letter was found, signed only Mimi. Amongst his belongings was a notebook Emil was keeping as a diary, along with stacks of letters found at Emil's lodgings and office going back 2 years, all signed with the signature Mimi. It wasn't long before everyone in Glasgow learned that Mimi was none other than Madeleine Hamilton Smith. Miss Smith was arrested and charged and would stand trial for the murder of Pierre Emile L'Angelier. Due to the age, beauty, and status of the defendant, and the content of the letters, which were read aloud in the court, the trial scandalized the Victorian public. The immense and sudden popular interest in the case caused the trial to be moved from Glasgow to Edinburgh's High Court, and began on June 30th in 1857. During the trial, Miss Smith was represented by one of the brightest legal minds of the time, John Ingalls, who led a brilliant defense of what he possibly thought was a guilty woman, as the evidence stacked against her. Emil and Madeline's correspondence came to an end in February 1857, in which she stated clearly that despite her feelings for him, she could not marry him, as she feared her father's wrath if she reneged on her promise to William Minnock. It was after Madeline had sent this missive to Emil that she sent her page boy for arsenic, although the request was refused, explaining that his mistress needed a physician's line to make the purchase. The letters show that the couple met a couple times after this incident. On that same day, Emil started to document his last days in a diary of sorts. An entry a few days later, on February 19th, recounts his taken ill after a visit to Madeline. L'Angelier's landlady found him violently ill, vomiting. The following morning, Madeleine Smith left her house in Blythewood Square and visited Murdoch Brothers' druggist in nearby Sauchiehall Street. She explained that she wanted to buy a 6 pence worth of arsenic. The pharmacist explained that she would have to sign for it, and inquired what she needed the arsenic for. Madeline explained that it was needed for the garden at the country house, and the assistant made up the ounce of arsenic, charging it to her father's account. It is unknown whether she met with Emil that night, but the next morning he came down with another bout of sickness. L'Angelier's diary for February 21st read, "Don't feel well," and the next day saw Mimi in drawing room, taken very ill. He would later confide to his landlady, "I can't think why I was so unwell after getting that coffee and chocolate from her." He went on to prophetically add, "It is a perfect fascination, my attachment to that girl. If she were to poison me, I would forgive her." On March 12th, Madeline set a date for her wedding to William for June. Less than a month later, Pierre Emile L'Angelier was dead. On March 31st, on returning to his lodging, he alarmed his landlady by clutching his stomach and groaning in pain. A doctor was sent for, who assured the patient that there was nothing seriously wrong, to which Pierre replied, "I am far worse than the doctor thinks." When the doctor returned to check on his patient later in the morning, L'Angelier was lying dead on the sofa. His landlady observed, "I heard he was going to be married. How sorry the lady will be." The next day, Emil's landlady traveled to the Smith family home in Blythewood Square to inform Madeline that her fiancé had died. On the same day, an autopsy was performed, which determined that Pierre L'Angelier had died from poisoning. Medical experts found enough arsenic in his body to kill 40 men. L'Angelier's employer arranged for his body to be buried in his family lair, but it did not lie there long. 5 days later, it was exhumed in order that investigators, who now suspected foul play, could make a fuller investigation. That afternoon, Madeleine Smith was arrested and gave a lengthy statement to the sheriff's substitute of Lanarkshire, claiming she hadn't seen Emil for 3 weeks. She did not deny writing to him or their discussions of marriage, nor did she deny making 3 purchases of arsenic in the previous month, claiming it was merely for cosmetic purposes. She had mixed the arsenic with water and washed her arms and face with it, a cosmetic use she had learned while at school. She had lied to the apothecary about the arsenic's use because she was too self-conscious to say that it was for her complexion. She claimed to have never administered or caused to be administered to Mr. L'Angelier arsenic or anything injurious, and this I declare to be truth. Due to the court rules of the time, Madeline was not allowed to take the stand in her own defense. She had to rely solely on her legal counsel and on her deposition. The defense painted Madeline as a pure and innocent maid, who had been a victim of a foul older man, who then turned blackmailer, and who then likely poisoned himself, as a result of Madeline attempting to break off the relationship. During the trial, people swarmed the courthouse to catch a glimpse of Madeline, and crowds lined the streets every night as her carriage took her back to the East Jail of Edinburgh. The newspapers carried detailed descriptions of every aspect of the trial, and the proceedings became the chief topic of conversation throughout Scotland. One journalist described Madeline in court. Smith stepped up the stair into the dock with all the buoyancy with which she might have entered the box of a theater. Her head never sank for a moment, and she even seemed to scan the witnesses with a scrutinizing glance. Her perfect self-possession, indeed, could only be accounted for either by a proud consciousness of innocence or by her possessing an almost unparalleled amount of self-control. The trial went on for 9 days, and many witnesses, including Madeline's sister Janet, who testified that she did not recall Madeline ever getting out of bed the night of March 22nd, and William Minnock took the stand. On his part, Minnock stood by Madeline throughout the trial, declaring that they would marry as soon as the trial was over. The prosecution called witnesses to testify about the contradictions in Madeline's story, but the defense countered with experts who discussed arsenic's cosmetic uses and pointed out how Emil had his first attack 2 days before Madeline's first recorded purchase of arsenic. They called witnesses claiming Emil had made statements to them regarding self-harm. An acquaintance from Edinburgh stated that Emil often spoke of being tired of his existence. Emil's outward show of charm and bravado masked deep-seated feelings of insecurity and vulnerability that were manifested in his hypochondria and melancholia. The few letters of his that survive show him to be demanding and oppressing. He would constantly criticize her behavior. He decided what clothes she should wear, who she could or could not talk to, and where she could go. He had compared her unfavorably to his other female acquaintances. Madeline's letters, in response, show a young woman who constantly sought his approval. The defense also produced 3 chemists as witness who claimed to have sold arsenic to a man matching L'Angelier's description. Madeline showed remarkable calmness and poise during the trial, refusing food and water while in court, only keeping a small vial of smelling salts, which she never had to use. She followed the questioning of witnesses closely and only showed discomfort when the text of some of her letters to Emil was read aloud. It is crucial to know that the evidence of L'Angelier's diary that documented his deteriorating health, often coinciding with visits with Madeline, was not entered as evidence in court. The prosecution and the defense both argued brilliantly, but due primarily to the fact that it could not be proven that Madeline and Emil had actually seen each other before any of his 3 attacks, the jury deliberated for only 30 minutes and reached a verdict of not proven, a unique verdict in Scotland that signifies that the accused was not found innocent, but the prosecution had not made a strong enough case to convict. The court erupted into applause and cheering, and Madeline went free that afternoon and returned to the Smith home. For many months afterwards, the notoriety of the trial did not cool, and it was clear that Madeline could no longer stay in Scotland. Far from marrying straight after the trial, Billy Minnock never saw his once fiancée again. The Smith family were ruined socially. They fled Glasgow, and soon after, Mrs. Smith took to her bed and became an invalid for the rest of her life. Madeline's younger sisters never married. Madeline herself moved to London with her younger brother James, then Plymouth, where she met a young artist named George J. Wardle. They married in London in 1861. With her first name changed to Lena, a childhood nickname, the Wardles settled in the flourishing Bohemian set in Bloomsbury. There she mingled with the pre-Raphaelite painters. She may even have posed for Rossetti at one time. Lena Wardle became a renowned Bloomsbury hostess. She started a fashion of foregoing tablecloths at her society dinner parties, using only placemats instead, a shocking convention at a time when even piano legs were covered. The Wardles had 2 children, Tom and Kitty. Eventually, George and Lena separated after 28 years of marriage. The former died in 1910 through natural causes. In 1916, Lena Wardle moved to New York to live with her son's family, where she married for a second time to a man named Sheehy, and lived until her death on April 12, 1928, at 92 years old. What actually happened on the night of March 23, 1857, may never be known, but the mystery continues to fascinate nearly 2 centuries later.